Part 1. Growing up, my grandpa Ted used to tell a lot of stories. They always involved hyperbole and wild exaggeration, but they were also always extremely entertaining. When we were really little, he would tell us more innocent stuff, mostly fishing stories or stories about the times that he rubbed elbows with famous people we'd never heard of. When we got older, though, he would tell us about some of the scarier stories, being in the Vietnam War, or the horrible car accidents he got in as a kid while racing cars down El Camino. "See these scars?" he would say, lifting his pant leg up just enough to expose an ugly hunk of scar tissue where a chunk of his calf should have been. "That's why I don't do stupid crap like drag race your friends." He would add a little aside to that story when I was in my later teenage years. "Especially after a pint of whiskey and a root toot of the good stuff." Always finishing with a wink and a smile. He was a born storyteller. The flourishes and the way he moved his arms and the inflections he would add to his voice always added to whatever tale he would tell. A story about him and his friends setting off fireworks in high school and having to outrun the cops in the hills would be told with a playful tone, lots of eyebrow wagging and side smiles. A story about being pinned down by enemy gunfire and praying for his life as he worked his damnedest to get their broken radio working. Somehow, he always ended up as the hero of his war stories, would be told with the grim and serious tone you would expect. There was one story, though, he would always save for special nights. It was about a hunting trip he took with his best friend Bobby, and what happens to them when they had to take shelter in a cave for the night. An unexpected storm had rolled in, and he and Bobby used the cave to get out of the rain. Little did they know that the cave was inhabited by a pack of Timberwolves. He described the way their eyes reflected his flashlight beam, the sound of their growls, how they slowly approached, and the harrowing showdown of him and Bobby having to use torches to fend them off as they snapped forward with bared teeth. It was his scariest one by far, and he'd always tell it around Halloween time, or maybe on a night after the power had gone out during a raging storm. He loved the theatrics of it all. My father loved to scoff at this story, but my brother, Jackie, and I would sit quietly and listen every time, enthralled with how well he told it. It was a wild story, even more so than all the rest. But the way his eyes would turn to slits as he whispered the most dangerous parts of the tale, it made you a believer. I think I was 16 the last time he told me this story, and it was a couple years before his death. My brother was 19 and already off with college by that point, so the last time I heard it told, it was just me and my grandfather. I can remember him putting his hand on my shoulder and squeezing as he cleared his throat. "Alex, I've told you this story half a dozen times, but tonight I think I'm gonna do something a little different," he grumbled, letting go of me and leaning back in his chair to pack his pipe. He lowered his brow in a way that almost made him look sinister in the low light of the room. He always turned down the lights when he'd tell his scary story. He said it set the tone better. "Different?" I raised an eyebrow and shifted on the couch nervously. "What do you mean? Are you not going to tell the story about when you were hunting with Bobby?" "And that's the story I'm going to tell you, all right. Except this time, I'm going to tell you the truth." He struck a match and took a few quick sucks on his pipe to get it going. The smoke billowed up in front of his face as he continued. "There were never any wolves in that cave. In fact, I don't even think Timberwolves roamed those forests. Bobby and I certainly didn't fend them off with torches pulled from our fire like the heroes from some adventure tale." "Come on, Grandpa, we all know you build your stories up a little bit to make them more fun to listen to. It's okay. We enjoy them anyway." I leaned forward to give him a reassuring look and a smile. I was surprised when he looked back at me and shook his head like I'd got him all wrong. "I didn't build this story up, kiddo. I toned it down. In fact, I changed it to a load of crap, because not only is it unbelievable, but I don't like to think about it." He leaned forward this time, his pipe gripped between his teeth, and the look on his face anything but reassuring.
So, what do you say, Alex? You want to hear what really happened?
A puff of smoke came out of his nose, and the look in his eyes told me he was deadly serious. Sometimes, when Grandpa would talk about his war stories, he would get the same look in his eyes. The 1,000-yard stare. Of course I do. I leaned back in my seat, fully expecting to be on the edge of it by the time he was done. Let's hear it.
Well, the first thing you should know is that it wasn't just me and Bobby. It was Bobby, me, and an armed buddy of ours named Dale Ordo. Or we called him Spoons on account of him playing spoons to fill time when we were on base.
Grandpa cracked a quick smile as he recalled his friend.
Spoons used to drive the sergeant nuts with that clicking and clacking. I swear there was a few days he came close to a beating over his instrument of choice.
I sat patiently, waiting for my grandfather to continue. He took another drag from his pipe and let the smoke curl out of the side of his mouth before clearing his throat. I was already starting to lean forward a bit. The fact that he had left this Spoons guy out of every other time he told the story had me wildly curious as to what might be coming next.
The rest of the setup you've heard before is all true. We were in our early 30s. We'd started doing this yearly hunting trip as a way to blow off steam after we got back from the war. It's important to have something like that for us, you know. Even long after we should have needed it, we kept going, like a tradition. Lordy, your grandma hated it, though. Bobby she could tolerate, but just like he did with the Sarge, Spoons rubbed your grandma the wrong way, something fierce. Not to mention, by that point, your dad had just turned 10, and he turned into a back-sessin'.
He looked behind me with a stretched neck, confirming that my dad was in fact not standing just in earshot with a scowl on his face. When he confirmed we were alone, he gave himself a satisfied smile and repeated himself.
A back-sessin' little shit.
I laughed at the thought of imagining my father that young in the first place, let alone him talking back to my gran, a woman who more than likely would have whacked him upside the head with a spoon.
Still, despite your grandma's protests, we went, every year like clockwork. It was a weekend trip, 3 days from Friday to Sunday. We'd drink beers and shoot the shit like old buddies do. We'd hunt some deer and brag about who got the best buck of that day, if you get one at all. And we'd just get some time away from the world. The forest tends to give some perspective. Anyway, we were halfway into the second day when this massive storm came barreling down on top of us. We checked the weather for that weekend. No one had said a thing about any kind of storm, let alone the whipping winds and driving rain that came with this one. It flooded our camp in less than an hour. Considering we were more than a half-day hike back to our truck, we decided to head upwards into the hills and look for some shelter.
And that's where you found the cave? I had heard the story enough times to know that at least this part was likely true. Still, it was interjected as an equal statement and question. Grandpa nodded, though, and shook a finger at me.
That's right, kiddo. That's where we found the cave. That goddamn cave. You're getting a bit ahead of me, though, so let me rewind this a bit.
Sorry, Grandpa, I said, a little embarrassed at my own excitement.
Let's see, where was I? Oh, yes. We were heading up into the hills to look for some shelter, so we packed up all our gear and started making the trek up the hill. I'll tell you, in that rain, the mud and rocks were so slick, there was more than once I thought I was going to fall and break my damn neck. Yet, we made it to a little outcropping. That's where Bill spotted the cave just a bit more up from where we were. No sooner had he pointed it out to me, where Spoons suddenly grabbed me by the shoulder and spun me to look at him.
Teddy, you hear that?
I heard him say, as I turned to look at him. His head was cocked to the side as if he were trying to hear past the wind. His eyes had narrowed down to slits, and his lips were pulled back, making his mouth look like nothing more than a lion. Spoons was always good at picking noises out of the fray. He was always the guy who saved you from some ambush because he was the first to hear some idiot shuffle his feet. He'd always make that face when he was trying to pick up on some sound that was just below the surface. I didn't hear anything but the wind, the Spoons. Why, you got something? There was no reason for me to be worried. Just 'cause Spoons heard some noise past the sound of the storm didn't mean we were in danger. But I was worried. Suddenly, I was real worried. I kept my eyes on him as he tried his damnedest to pick back up on what he'd heard.
I thought I heard something, like howling or screeching.
Like a wolf.
Bobby suddenly came into the conversation. One look at Spoon's face, and I knew he felt that same anxiety about it I did. I tried to tell myself it was just leftover instinct from the war. The last time I'd seen him make that face, gunfire came screaming at us a few seconds later. I should have known, though. Always trust your gut.
No, not like a wolf.
Spoons listened intensely for a few more seconds as the rain hammered us, and the wind began to threaten our ability to hold our footing. Suddenly, as if he was woken from some wild dream, Spoons turned his head and looked at me, the intensity gone from his eyes.
Whatever it was, it's gone. I can't hear it anymore.
You good? I asked him, clapping my hand on his shoulder and feeling not quite good myself. He nodded in a way that told me something was still making him feel like he had a gut full of ice, a feeling I shared.
Keep your head on a swivel anyway, just in case. You guys want to get moving? I'm already soaked down to the bone, and I want to get dry and wait this shit out.
Bobby was starting to get antsy, and I understood. We could have stayed on that hill all day. Lightning was already streaking across the sky, followed by some kind of thunder that rattled your bones. I looked at Spoons, who nodded like he was okay to keep moving, and then I looked at Bobby and motioned my head towards the cave. So, we kept climbing. Up and up we went till we reached that cave. Goddamn to mouth the hill, that place. Remembering it now, it looks more menacing, like the giant gaping maw of some horrible demon sent straight from my nightmares. At the time, though, I knew to all of us it just looked like a cave. It looked like a shelter, and a chance to get warm and dry. I swear, though, as we walked into that place, lightning flashed right above our heads and thunder rolled, like it was the editor's design for some horrible picture. We made a fire and got warm. We got out of our rain gear and into some dry clothes, and Spoons cooked us up a canned stew to fill our bellies. The storm kept raging outside, but we were happy with our shelter, telling stories and laughing by the fire as we ate dinner. It was the last time we ever got to be like that. Just three friends, getting out to the woods to hunt some deer and get some perspective. Just three old soldiers. Suddenly, he looked as if he'd just taken a punch to the gut. There was an old anguish on his face, and it was obvious that reliving this memory was hard for him. I suddenly wondered why he would tell me this version of the story at all. Everything was fine until we slept. He picked the story back up after a brief pause where he simply stared into the fire and smoked his pipe. It was the same look he'd get on his face when he'd get a little too honest with the war stories. My father called it the 1,000-yard stare. I woke to the sound of footsteps echoing off the cave walls. I sat up and looked around to see a dying fire, and behind that was Spoons. He was facing the back wall of the cave, shining his flashlight up and down the rock like he was looking for something. "Spoons, what the hell you doing?" I said to him, just loud enough to not wake Bobby. Then again, we always said a mortar could go off next to that dolt's head and he'd sleep through it. "Sounds woke me up. The guns are gone." Spoons turned back to look at me. His face was grim and pale, making him look like a ghost in the dim firelight. "Something took him and vanished deeper into the cave." "What the hell are you talking about? There is no deeper into the cave." I was already springing up out of my sleeping bag and hunting around our camp for our rifles. We'd inspected the cave when we came in to make sure it was safe. It was only about 15 feet deep. We could see the back wall from where we made camp. "I saw it, Teddy. It was pale, white, with a little glow to it, like phosphor. It just vanished into the wall." He was stuck on the idea, hunting around the back of a cave like a madman looking for some kind of opening. Like a, excuse my French, kid, but I think you're old enough, fucking ghost. I'd grabbed up the flashlight and started looking around the cave with him when my quick search for our guns didn't bear any fruit.
No, not like a ghost.
He turned to look at me, shaking his head.
It looked like a man, but it moved like an animal. Whatever it was, though, it was as solid as you and me.
I knew the look I gave him was a puzzled one. Nothing he was saying was making sense, but it was true enough that our guns were gone. I'd known Spoons going on 15 years at that point, and he wasn't a man prone to exaggerating or flights of fancy. We stood there for what felt like forever in silence, just staring at each other. The only sounds, the pitter-patter of rain outside, and the soft snore of our friends who was proving his ability to sleep through anything. "It's hard to believe, Spoons," I finally said to him. The silence broken as I went back to searching for some kind of way, though.
Just help me look, Teddy.
He furrowed his brow a bit and placed a hand on the stone, like he was going to feel it out somehow. I ran back over to the fire and threw on a bit more fuel. It blazed up again, sending a new warmth into the cave, making it a bit lighter to help with the search. The new wave of heat finally woke up Bobby, who sat up with what we called De Niro face. That was Bobby's version of tired and confused. My grandpa's eyes squinted as he stuck his chin out. It made me laugh, but I was nervous. The story he was telling me was nothing like the wolf story I grew up with. It wasn't just tense, it was making me feel uneasy. It wasn't what he'd said so far that made me so uncomfortable either. It was the way he told it, and the gravity in his voice. I wanted him to get back to it. I needed to know what happens next. "So, did you guys find an opening?" I asked eagerly at the tail end of my laugh. My grandfather's face, which had taken on a moment of levity, suddenly drooped again as he was reminded of what story he was telling. "I found it." I'd given Bobby a quick rundown that I think he just barely absorbed. He was at least awake enough to understand that our guns had gone missing, and that was enough to get him to his feet. We all combed the back wall using our flashlights, despite the fact that I was still skeptical about what Spoons had said he saw. It seemed more plausible that whoever had taken our guns had gone out the mouth of the cave, but he seemed so damn determined that I helped him look. Honestly, I was about ready to give up too when I found it. It was impossible to see in the dark, and if I hadn't have stood back in frustration, ready to tell everyone we should hang it up, my flashlight never would have caught it. It was above our heads, near the top of the cave's back wall. It was maybe a foot in height, about 3 feet long, but it was an opening for sure. First, I wasn't actually going to say anything, seeing as how the damn thing was about 8 feet off the ground, and even a child would have a hell of a time squeezing through it. But I decided to point it out to Spoons, just so he'd stop going crazy.
"That's gotta be it,"
he said to me. His eyes were wide as if he was looking at something amazing. "I'll admit, it's big enough to hide our guns, but how could anyone squeeze through there?" I had barely finished voicing my doubt before Spoons was already trying to scale the wall to get a look inside. Bobby pocketed his flashlight and ran over to give him a boost as I shook my head and stood back from him and shined mine upwards towards the opening. With Bobby's help, it was easy to get Spoons high enough to have a peek inside, so I just wanted to make sure he had some extra light.
"It's still pretty dark in there,"
Spoons said, reaching into his coat for his own flashlight and pulling it out while still trying to hold on to the edge of the opening. Below, I could see Bobby huffing and puffing as he attempted to hold up the extra weight that Spoons was giving him. Little more proof that we weren't quite as young or light as we used to be. Spoons finally managed to click on his flashlight, get a better look deeper into the hole.
"See our guns?"
I swallowed hard, suddenly very nervous about the situation.
"Or anything else?" "It gets bigger the further back it gets, and I can feel air coming from the other side."
He looked over his shoulder, caught my gaze briefly before he returned to examine the opening. There was a look in his eyes. He knew how off this all was, just as much as I did. "Careful, Dale." The words came out of my mouth as a near whisper, so I didn't know if he heard it. I hadn't called him Dale in years, though. I still always think of him as Spoons when he crosses my mind. To this day, I don't know what compelled me to call him by his real name in that moment.
I think I see them.
He suddenly shouted out.
Good, your fat ass is killing me down here.
Bobby answered, his face starting to turn red, but his voice full of humor. That was one thing Bobby was always good at, trying to make us laugh when the tension in a room was palpable. His half-joke made me crack a smile, but as I watched Spoons reach into the cavern, I knew things were about to go wrong deep down in the pit of my stomach. He suddenly jerked forward and let out a yelp. Bobby was caught off guard by the sudden movement and nearly fell on his ass trying to adjust, but in the end, he managed to keep hold of Bobby's foot.
Something just grabbed me,
Spoons shouted out. The words echoed around the cave and reached my ears in a way that made them seem almost dreamlike. Everything after that happened so fast. Spoons jerked forward again, this time much harder. I heard the sound of his head slam against the cold stone of the cave, even over the sound of his scream. The sudden shift of his weight threw Bobby off again. This time, though, Spoons' knee came up and caught him in the nose. Bobby went sprawling to the ground, and I expected Spoons to go tumble into the ground with him. He didn't, though. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw my friend dangling from the hole by one arm. He had been pulled in hard up to his shoulder, his face pressed against the rock, and all his remaining limbs were pushing back against whatever was attempting to drag him inside. My grandfather paused, stopping his story, and that stare came over his face again. He looked lost inside his own head, and I sat patiently for what felt like ages before I had to say something. "Grandpa Ted, are you okay?" I reached out and touched his hand, and he turned to look at me with a solemn expression that he quickly attempted to cover up with a weak and forced smile. He patted my hand and nodded before he packed his now extinguished pipe.
I told you at the start I was going to tell you the real story, but I'm not sure I want to finish this one.
His voice made him sound like a million miles away. He struck a new match and relit his pipe, causing a new billow of smoke to rise up in front of his face.
Hey, Grandpa, that's not fair.
I whined like a child who'd just been told he couldn't have a cookie before dinner. It didn't seem fair to me at all, though. He couldn't start that story and get me invested in it and then just cut me off. I needed to know what was going to happen next.
I suppose it's not,
he said, his face drooping down now like a melted candle. He looked old by the light of that fire. For the first time, I could see the weary old man behind my normally cheery grandfather.
This was a mistake, though.
Please, Grandpa, I'm on the edge of my seat here. I need to know what happens next.
He just kept smoking his pipe and staring into the fire, as if it was going to answer some question he'd asked. My eyes were fixed on him. I could see the subtle twitch in his eye and the nervous tap of his finger. I watched as he gripped the pipe between his teeth, and I saw a single tear stream down his cheek. He was the type of man who idolized the strong, silent type. He was John Wayne or Gary Cooper. A single tear coming from his eye was akin to anyone else openly sobbing. Without a word in response, he continued his story. Bobby got back to his feet as I dropped my flashlight and rushed over to grab Spoons by the leg and start pulling him in the opposite direction. Bobby grabbed the other leg and joined me, but even with the two of us pulling and Spoons attempting to wriggle free from the grasp of whatever had him, the damn thing wouldn't let go.
Pull harder!
Spoons followed up his command with a scream of agony as he was wrenched forward once again. I heard his head smack against the rock and half expected to look up to see him knocked out. He persisted, though. The tough son of a bitch that he was. Even in the low light, I could see the gash that opened up above his eye and the blood that was already starting to stream down his face.
What the fuck is going on?
Bobby yelled, his face just as cherry red and sweaty as when he was holding Spoons up. He's a big guy, and back then he was strong as an ox, yet he was working as hard as he could to get Spoons free, and it wasn't working. Spoons screamed again, in pain, as me and Bobby pulled in unison, instinctively easing up on how hard we yanked on his legs as he responded.
I don't care if you tear my arm from the socket, don't you dare let go of me.
Something beyond the cave wall responded as well. An inhuman screech that felt like it might rupture my eardrums echoed through the little cave. It was followed by clicking noises and the sounds of falling rocks. I didn't want to picture what might be back there based on the noises it made, so I tried to focus on getting my friend free. The tug-of-war went on like that for what my memory tells me was hours. I knew it couldn't have been more than a couple of minutes, though. It felt like we were indeed going to have to rip his arm from the socket to get him free. And it may have just come to that if Bobby hadn't slipped on some loose gravel beneath his feet. He lost his footing, and the momentum of him pulling so hard sent him barreling to me. I tried to hold on to Spoons' leg, but my grip was lost as Bobby and I both fell to the ground. He stopped his story again and set his pipe down on the table next to him. He took a deep breath and rubbed his hands over his face as I waited patiently for the next part of his story. He gave me a brief look that I now think was his way of asking me to tell him he could stop, that he didn't have to finish, that I knew what came next. Except I gave him no such reassurance, and to this day, I feel regret when I think of that moment. It only took a split second after we lost our grip, he continued, his voice falling to more of a hushed tone, and his eyes now focused exclusively on the fire. I heard this sickening crack as Spoons was yanked forward again, hard. See, his head hit the rocks again as the thing pulled on him, but this time it knocked him out. Worse than that, the thing kept pulling, and with a couple more hard yanks, it broke his damn neck. I looked up to see my friend's head twisted all wrong on his shoulders and covered in blood. It was a sight I'll never forget, even though I only saw it for a second or two before whatever was on the other side finally succeeded in dragging him through the opening. Spoons was gone. Jesus Christ. The words fell from my mouth like I was spitting out marbles. I didn't really know what else to say. Jesus. Hell, kiddo, I doubt even God himself can see into that cave. He picked his pipe back up and packed it down with his thumb before striking another match. Bobby grabbed me by the arm before I could scramble up the wall and go after my friend. Not that I would have fit, mind you, but I wasn't exactly in my right mind at the time.
Teddy, we need to get the hell out of here.
He was hollering at me and dragging me along towards the camp.
Grab your gear and let's go.
I can't really remember what I said to him. I was mumbling and incoherent. I'd seen horrors in the war, things way worse than what I'd just seen happen to Spoons. It wasn't supposed to happen there, though. Not in our woods. Not when we were home. I felt like I was having some kind of nightmare, and I think I was willing myself to wake up. The next thing I remember is Bobby slapped me across the face and grabbed my shoulders.
Spoons is dead, and we need to get out of here and get to the police.
He let go of my shoulders and reached behind him to grab my bag. He shoved my gear into my arms.
Move out, soldier.
Made me feel sick to my stomach. I followed him, though, leaving behind any gear we didn't need, and stepped out into the rain with the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon and attempt to break through the clouds. We made our way down the hill. Bobby yelled out a few times, asking me what the hell had just happened, but of course, I didn't have any answer for him. I was wondering the same damn thing myself. I recalled what Spoons had told me he saw when he first woke up. Pale, looked like a man, but moved like an animal. Apparently, it had a glow to it. Then, I reconciled that with what I knew. It was strong enough to win a tug-of-war with two full-grown men. It was smart enough to take our guns from us while we slept. And it made a noise like some kind of demon from hell. "So, what was it?" I enthusiastically asked, eager as ever to soak up every last bit of information from the story. My grandpa paused and looked at me with a grim expression, turning his mouth downwards and narrowing his eyes to slits. I have no fucking idea. His tone wasn't angry or sad like I might have expected. It was cold. Those 5 words delivered in that fashion sent a chill down my spine, and I decided it was best to keep my mouth shut till he said he was done with this story, and maybe even after that, for a while. We made it back to the car and got out of there. When we were able to get to the authorities, we told them some animal attacked Spoons in the cave, and we didn't really get a good look at it. There was some suspicion that maybe we did something out there that got him killed, or we just outright murdered him. I knew that would be coming, but figured once Spoon's body was found, then we'd be in the clear. Thing is, they never found his body. We let him right back into that cave. A team of cops, forest rangers armed to take down a bear or a mountain lion if need be. The opening that Spoons got pulled through was gone, though. The cave had nothing more than a solid black wall and barely enough room for all of us to comfortably stand in. All the questions came next. Are you sure this is the cave? Are you sure nothing else happened? Where's the body? We know you know more than you're saying. They combed those woods for a couple weeks looking for Spoon's body, but it came up empty. He officially went into the books as a missing person. Me and Bobby were looking at each other side-eyed for a while, too. Everyone's still thinking we killed our own friend. Eventually, me and your grandma just moved away from there, decided to raise your dad somewhere else. My grandfather groaned as he set his pipe down on the table next to him and got to his feet. He shot me one last look and attempted a smile that looked fake to me. That's the end of the story, kiddo. I'm heading off to bed,
he said, suddenly, sounding like his old self again. That's it? I said. As soon as the words left my mouth, his eyes narrowed at me again, and he took a step in my direction.
That's it.
Well, fuck, I said, feeling free to use that word around my grandfather for the first time.
Language?
He barked at me sharply.
Listen, the world doesn't wrap things up in a nice little bow for you. Sometimes things just end.
He started to walk away towards the stairs so we could head off to bed.
Just remember, there are things out there that no one's gonna teach you about, kid. 'Cause no one knows.
With those words, my grandfather vanished up the stairs, and I heard his bedroom door close behind him. I sat, slack-jawed and confused on the couch for the next half hour before deciding to try and sleep myself. As I passed my grandpa's room, though, I heard something that made me give pause and listen. It sounded like crying. I tiptoed over to the door and put my ear up against it. Sure enough, what I heard on the other side was the sound of full-on crying, something I didn't even know my tough-as-nails grandfather was capable of. Then I heard something else that I wouldn't understand till years later.
I'm sorry, Tyler.
Interlude. Over the next decade, I thought several times about asking my grandfather if the story he'd told me had been the truth. It wasn't as much that I thought he was making it up, as much as I thought that he'd held something back. Like there was more to the story. One time I came close to just directly asking him who Tyler was, but I couldn't bring myself to pose the question. The way he'd sounded that night, both telling the story and then after, when he didn't know I was listening, I think maybe it was best to just let it go. When I was 26, my grandfather passed away from a stroke. The whole family took it pretty hard. He was our heart and soul. Ever the man of stories, he would have loved the amount of friends and family who told the stories at his funeral. Great stories about his boisterous nature and can-do attitude, all while a pipe hung from his mouth and he puffed away. My great-aunt Sarah had just finished a wonderful story about how Grandpa Ted had one time rescued a chocolate lab from the overflowing river during flood season. A dog she then adopted and named Baxter, whom she briefly spoke about before wrapping up. It was the ending which really caught my attention, though. Ted is with his lovely wife Harriet now, and they are reunited with Tyler. I'll miss them all every day, till God sees me fit to join them. I looked at my father, who made a pained face.
Dad,
Who's Tyler? I asked, keeping my voice at a whisper as the next person took the pulpit to speak about Grandpa. Now that the name had been spoken in public, it was like some dam burst in me, and the question I'd wanted to ask Grandpa when he was alive finally came out.
not now, Alex.
He bit his lip and turned his attention to a man from the Elks Lodge, talking about how many beers Grandpa could drink. I didn't press the issue, for obvious reasons, but I didn't forget either. As the Elk Lodge man was successfully getting a laugh with a story, a difficult thing at a funeral, the look on my father's face told me he wasn't going to forget anytime soon either. Tyler was my brother. My father poured himself a whiskey and then tipped the bottle to me. I nodded and he made me one too. He dropped it on the table in front of me in silence and loosened his tie as he took his first sip. How come no one's ever told me about him before? I asked, already knowing the answer. My father was a lot like my grandfather, and neither one of them talked about how they felt, and pain was better buried than discussed. He died when I was just a kid. He took the rest of his drink in one big swallow before pouring himself another. He was quite a bit older than me. I was only 6 when he passed away. How did it happen? I took a sip, feeling that pleasant burn soothe the ache in my chest. My father paused and took another drink like he was trying to remember. He was 18, I believe. He died in a hiking accident, lost his footing on a steep hill and broke his neck in the fall. Damn, that's awful. I spoke the words to myself as much as I did to my father. I took another sip and stared down into the glass, not knowing what else to say. Yeah, it's all pretty hazy to me. I was too young. He finally took a seat at the table with me, the sound of the chair dragging across the floor, breaking the silence before either of us could. Your grandfather, well, he didn't handle it too well. He was with Tyler at the time, saw it happen. I think he blamed himself for taking Tyler hiking that day. Mom did her best to help him through it, even though her heart was shattered. It was a rough time. I remembered what I heard my grandfather saying the night after he told me the story about spoons. I'm sorry, Tyler. Why would he be saying sorry to Tyler on the night he told me about how Spoons died? Maybe the story just jostled up a lot of bad memories, and he kind of took a trip down a spiral of regret. It happens to the best of us. I just had a feeling that there was something more to it. My father and I finished our drinks in mostly silence, never really sure what to say to each other in times of emotional stress. In the back of my mind, I thought about the cave, and how that story hadn't gotten out from under my skin a decade later. I found myself wishing I'd asked my grandfather certain questions before he was gone. I also found myself wishing I could have told him I loved him. I would never get the chance to say what I wanted to say, but a few answers and many more questions would come only a few weeks later. Part 2. When the time came to pack up my grandfather's things, I was given the inglorious task of cleaning out the attic. It was stacked with old holiday decorations, furniture that had gone unused for decades, boxes of assorted junk. I half imagined to run across a box marked Tyler among the cobwebs and clutter. In my head, the mysterious box answered all the leftover questions that only Grandpa could have answered. I did indeed find some answers in that attic, but not in a box marked with the name of the uncle I never knew, but instead, they were in a box marked books. Being the ever-curious reader, I rifled through the box as soon as I found it. There were a few things to note that I set aside, an old copy of Treasure Island and an even older copy of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, some old do-it-yourself home repair manuals that may come in use someday, and a leather-bound journal with the initials T.L. monogrammed on the front. The initials could have belonged to my grandfather, Theodore Langquist, or Tyler. A quick rifle through the pages proved it was most certainly my grandfather's, though. I'd found his book of stories. I never knew he'd written them down, but all the ones I remembered growing up were there. I flipped through till I found the story about the cave and hoped it was the real story and not the one about the wolves. When I saw the mention of spoons, I quickly threw all the books back in the box and brought it downstairs to take home with me that night. I told my father I was going to go through them that night and see if there was anything I wanted to keep. I'd bring anything to donate back in the morning. He nodded unquestioningly and let out an approving grunt as he got back to his work. When I finally finished up for the day, I went home, and before doing anything else, I pulled the book out and flipped through to the story I was most interested in. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and relaxed in my armchair. I expected the story to have more answers. This had been written for him, after all, but what I found was that everything he told me that night was exactly as he'd written it down for himself. I reached the end and sucked down the last sip of my beer and frowned. I guess I was happy he'd told me the truth about what happened that day, but at the same time, there was this gnaw at the base of my neck that told me there was more. A gnaw that hadn't gone away for 10 years. I flipped through the remainder of the book, and at first I thought the story about spoons in the cave was going to be the last one. As I reached the last dozen or so pages, though, I realized that wasn't the case. The last story wasn't quite like the rest. It had a title, and it was set apart from everything else. This wasn't a story he'd told me as a kid, and I'd wager it wasn't a story he told anyone. When I read the title, I decided to grab another beer before I continued on.
My confession. I tell myself over and over again that I told that damn boy not to follow me. What needed doing needed to be done by me and me alone, and he had no business tagging along. He was stubborn, though, a trait he got from his mom and me in equal measure. The reality is that it's my fault, though. Never should have said anything to Tyler. Never should have tried so hard to stop him from coming once he did find out, and once he showed up, I should have done more to protect him. I told Harriet what I could manage to get out. I didn't lie to her. I never could. I didn't know if she'll ever forgive me, and to be honest, I couldn't blame her. The look she gave me as she scooped little Cal up in her arms and walked out the front door chilled my spine, put a rock in the pit of my stomach. This is a guilt I'm not sure I can live with, and a story I think I'll only be able to fully tell on these pages. The cops have finally stopped looking at me and Bobby as suspects in Spoon's death. I expected to feel relief, but instead I was angry. None of what happened made a lick of sense to me, and I was never a man who could bear being kept in the dark. I can remember the night that Bobby called me, said he was happy when the cops finally backed off and stopped giving him the business. He talked about how he was thinking of taking off, getting out of town and maybe heading south. I listened politely to the man who'd been my friend for years, but instead I hated his thick-skulled ability to just move on from what we'd seen. Not to say it didn't hurt him. Spoons was his friend too, after all. But his ability to just walk away now that it was over, I hated him for his ability to grieve silently. I sat on my porch, chain smoking, remembered the sight of Spoon's broken neck for hours after we hung up. Harriet came out on the porch and tried to comfort me. She was always good at telling when I was broken, even when I did my best to hide. I jumped to the feeling of her hand on my shoulder. She knew right away that I was off. I didn't listen to what she said next. She told me to let it go. She told me that even if it never made sense, that I had to let it go. It was advice I should have heeded, but instead, I did the exact opposite. That night, I made the choice to go back. It was a few days later, when I was packing up my gear and getting ready to make my way back to that damn cave, that I heard Tyler's voice behind me. "What are you doing, Dad?" His words were stern, and he used the voice of an adult punishing a child. I tried to look at him with a scowl, but my face softened when I saw him lean up against the door frame from giving me the steely look he inherited from me. "Pay it no mind, son. There's just something I had to take care of this weekend. I should be back Sunday night." I turned back to my bag and zipped it up, walked over to the closet and pulled down my shotgun and a box of shells. "Pop, if you think I'm gonna pay it no mind when you pull down a shotgun, you have another thing coming." He walked over to me, put a hand on my shoulder. He squeezed and looked at me with the face of a man. It was amazing to see how much he'd grown. "You're going back to that cave. aren't you?
The one where Spoons died.
It doesn't matter. I need you to stay here, watch out for your mother and little brother while I'm gone. I shrugged off his hand, a gesture I regret in retrospect.
I'm not letting you go out there alone.
He spoke with concern, but not enough to break the foolish persistence that was my nature. The nature I'd find he shared. You're not letting me? I scoffed at him and threw my gun down next to my bag before turning back to him and sticking a finger in his chest like I was some kind of bully. Last time I checked, I'm the father and you're the son. You don't let me do anything.
Dad.
I cut him off before he could finish his next thought. You do what I say. Do you understand me, Tyler?
He lowered his head with a slight frown and nodded.
What was that? Speak up. I barked.
Yes, sir.
He answered. I should have known right then, though, what was going to happen next. I should have known what I would do were I him at his age, and my father made such a foolish choice. I think on some level I did, even as I packed up my truck, saw him watching from the window as I drove off. On some level, I knew. The drive towards where I'd need to park and hike up to the cave was one filled with a nervous energy and potent determination. The cops had missed something when they searched the area. I knew they had. There had to be some way to find a way into where that thing drugged Spoons. I felt it in my bones. As I was pulling my gear out of my truck and getting ready to hike up, I heard another car come pulling into the clearing. I stepped around to look at the entrance, saw Tyler's car slowly rolling up behind me. I remember muttering, "Son of a bitch," under my breath. As I walked towards him, I could see the look on his face as he braced for the barrage he knew was coming. "Tyler, what the hell are you doing here? I told you, stay home with your mother and brother." I was yelling at him as soon as the door opened. He got out, and before he even responded, he went over to the truck and started gathering up his own gear.
Mom and Cal will be fine on their own. We live in the suburbs, for God's sake.
He slung his bag over his shoulder, pulled out my spare hunting rifle.
You need my help here.
I felt a flash of anger when I saw him take my gun out so casually, as if he'd asked my permission. Tyler was a smart boy, capable boy, and a pig-headed jackass when he was so inclined. Rarely, though, was he so defiant and disrespectful towards me. I caught myself before I started screaming at him. I knew what he was doing was based only in his concern for me. He was being the best son he could think to be by disobeying me. "Tyler," I took a deep breath and did my best to calm myself. "I need you to turn around and go."
No.
He looked me dead in the eye as he spoke. "Tyler, this isn't an argument." I started to raise my voice again.
You're right, Dad. It isn't. I'm coming with you and watching your back.
He started loading rounds into the rifle, exactly as I taught him on our annual deer hunt. He turned back to me and motioned towards the trail that led into the woods.
Lead the way.
I paused for a moment. The sight of Spoons' death danced through my head while I thought about how to proceed. Tyler didn't give quarter when he set his sights on something. At times I felt like the son, and him the father. No amount of yelling, pleading, or convincing was going to get him to turn back around. "Stay behind me. Follow toe for toe in my footsteps. And if I tell you to run, you do it."
Yes, Pa. You got it.
He nodded, finally relinquishing control of the situation now that he knew I wasn't going to try to dissuade him anymore.
No questions.
I barked. He responded with another sharp nod and a bit of a smirk. Wanted to slap him and give him a hug at the same time. In retrospect, I wish I'd done both. I loaded my shotgun, called my gear, and walked into the woods, with Tyler at my heels. The hike in took us most of the day, so we ended up camping at the foot of the hill just before the sun dipped down behind it. Tyler asked me a few questions about what exactly we were looking for, and I told him the truth. The truth being that I had no fucking clue. He asked me again exactly how Spoons died, and I declined that information as best I could before pivoting the talk to dinner. I cooked a trail stew over the fire. We ate in near silence, both of us clearly absorbed in thought. He asked why I wouldn't tell him everything and about what Spoons told me before he died. Pale white and glowing like phosphor. Looked like a man, but moved like an animal. Neither Bobby nor I saw what took him that night. What he described, though, it didn't sound like anything I ever heard of. I've told myself over and over again, it must have been a bear. A bear would have the strength to pull him in like that, and Spoons may have been half asleep when he saw the white glowing thing he thought he saw. But a bear didn't make the sounds I heard, and a bear can't crawl through a space that most men would have trouble squeezing into. Most importantly, a bear wasn't smart enough to steal our guns. That leaves a man as the only culprit. A man will be smart enough. A man could possibly be small enough to squeeze through that hole and cover it up before we could get back. I could not make out the sounds of whatever was behind the wall, though, and a man small enough to squeeze through the hole in the back wall of the cave wouldn't be likely to have the strength to pull Spoons away from Bobby and myself. I pulled out a cigarette, chewed a bit on the filter as I ran the night through my thoughts over and over again. I was broken from the trance by the sound of Tyler's voice.
Dad!
He shouted, staring at me from across the fire. What is it, Tyler? I shook my head loose and met his eyes.
Are you gonna smoke that? Or were you planning on eating it?
He pointed at my cigar with a smile. I gave a half-hearted smile in return and pulled out my lighter. There was a moment of silence as the lighter's flame danced over my face. Then Tyler spoke again.
Thanks for letting me come, Dad.
I think I smirked. We both knew I hadn't let him do anything. I wonder sometimes if I'm making excuses, though, about not pushing him harder to leave. He was a stubborn boy, but I should have tried more rather than just allowing him to come when I knew the risks involved. Harriet is right to blame me. Get some sleep, I told him. We'll hike up and look around the cave in the light of day. Tyler nodded and headed off to his tent. As he was zipping it closed, I raised my hand and told him one last thing. Keep your gun close by. His eyes grew wide, as if the seriousness of what I just said finally washed over him. I think that was the first moment he realized that we might be in actual danger out there under the stars. His face straightened out, and his lips turned into a thin line for a moment before he responded.
You too.
That would be the last conversation I would ever have with my oldest son. I woke up to what sounded like a gunshot, followed closely by a shout. Both seemed distant, but it could have been the fog of sleep washing away and giving everything a dreamlike quality as my eyes adjusted to the darkness around me. When my brain caught up to my body, I scrambled to collect my shotgun and stumbled out of my pup tent, shouting for Tyler to wake up. Tyler was gone, though, his tent flap left hanging open. My eyes searched the darkness of the woods around me, hoping to catch sight of him, but I could barely see 2 feet in front of my face. I shouted his name a couple more times before frantically rummaging through my pack for a flashlight. Just as I pulled one out and flicked it on, I was stopped dead as I heard another gunshot, followed by another shot, coming from further up the hill, towards the direction of the cave. It was Tyler's voice, and he was shouting for help. I sprinted towards the sound. My flashlight bounced up and down through the trees as I held it alongside my readied shotgun. The gunshots stopped, but the screams for help continued. Further and further up the hill they took me. I knew they were leading me right to the mouth of that damn cave. I reached the plateau that Spoons had been standing on when he first heard the sound. I looked up, and in the dark I could see the cave. I could make out a faint white glow at the precipice to the entrance. I continued making my way up, Tyler's screams echoing off the stone as he moved into the cave. My fingers clawed at dirt, and I felt dried mud crumble beneath my feet as I scrambled to reach my son. The faint white glow slowly faded deeper into the cave. By the time I reached the mouth, it vanished entirely. My lungs burned from making the climb so quickly, and I doubled over as I stopped in front of the cave to catch my breath. I took a knee-deep breath as I stared into the dark. In that moment, the noise of the world seemed to fade out, and some kind of clicking noise faded in. The sound was coming from directly in front of me, so as I got to my feet, I pointed my flashlight in that direction. I could see a figure sitting just out of reach of my beam, as if the light itself refused to touch it. It looked human, like a man sitting in a chair and painted in silhouette. Behind him, where there should have been nothing but a wall, I could see a massive door that's rounded top stretched all the way to the top of the cave. The figure was making some kind of motion with its hands that caused the clicking noise to echo through the cave. As I watched it make rhythmic motions, I realized what I was hearing. It was the sound of someone playing spoons. "Dale?" I asked the darkness, knowing full well that wasn't possible. I'd seen spoons die. The clicking noise stopped, and the figure that had been looking down turned its head towards me. 2 pinpoints of white light marked its eyes as it got to its feet. I raised my shotgun and stepped forward, hoping the light would reveal the face of whatever was standing in front of me, but it continued to shun the light. "Dear Daddy," it whispered to me in Spoons' voice. "You're dead. I saw you die." I shouted into the darkness to remind myself that what I was seeing and hearing couldn't be real. "That just helped me heal well." The shape's head lolled to the side, its neck bent in an unnatural way. "Do you hear it, Daddy?" Suddenly, his mouth gaped open, and a light shone back at me from within. My head started to feel foggy. My knees began to grow weaker. In what was little more than a reaction, I squeezed the trigger of my shotgun. The sound of the gunshot echoing off the cave walls and the kick against my shoulder pulled me back into the moment. There was a screech that sounded somewhere between human and animal as the spots in front of my eyes cleared just in time for me to see the thing slither away into the shadows of the door behind it. I let the gun drop to my side as I stood there. It felt as if all the energy had been sapped from my body, my will to move just taken from me, even to go after Tyler. I grit my teeth and forced myself to raise the flashlight towards the door, and with every ounce of strength I could muster, I put one foot in front of the other and stepped forward. My attention was now fixed on the impossible door as I studied it. It was built into the previously solid wall on the back of the cave. I knew for a fact that it was the same one where Spoons had been killed, and the same one we investigated with the police later. So when I say the door was impossible, I mean there is no way in the name of heaven it should be there, though I'm nearly sure it was the will of hell that it was. There was an opening that stretched nearly to the ceiling that was framed by perfectly even stones. It looked built and designed like that was its proper place in the world. The stones across the top of the door bared an inscription, and as I swept my flashlight over it and read the words to myself, I felt a chill down my spine. "Those who slumber must not wake." I stepped through the doorway, my ears pricked, listening for Tyler. I thought about calling for him as I crossed the threshold into the chilly dark of that place beyond the stone, but the words above the door echoed in my head, and I reconsidered. A foul smell rose up from the bowels of the cave, a stench like rotten fruit and shit that stung my nostrils and forced tears into my eyes. I expected to hear the sound of my footsteps echoing off the cave walls as I descended down a slope towards wherever this madness saw fit to take me. But instead, silence seemed to fill that place to the point where it felt like a tangible thing pressing down on my shoulders. It wasn't just my footsteps that seemed muffled. It was everything. All the little sounds you take for granted while living your daily life. The swoosh of my clothing as I walked, the creak of metal and wood as I shifted the gun in my hands, even the sound of my own breathing. The path that led deeper into the cave seemed to form some kind of natural staircase that seemed to be taking me deeper into the heart of the hills. As I shined my light around, the walls glistened as if they were drenched in water. But when I reached out and ran a finger over the stone, I realized it was a much more viscous fluid that came away in strands as I pulled my finger away. I shook the gunk off and made a disgusted noise that I don't think I realized I didn't hear at the time. Suddenly, something glowing with a faint white light dashed across my line of sight. I wheeled the light in the direction that it went, but before I could fix my eyes on it, the thing had vanished into the shadows. I hunted through the dark with my finger on the trigger, and as I turned back towards the direction I'd come, something else darted in front of me, and I felt it pushed me backwards as I did. I pointed the gun as it spun on its heel and raced toward me again like a ghostly blur. I fired. Not a fucking sound. The muzzle flash sent spots sprawling across my vision, and the recoil pushed me back on my weak footing so much that when the thing struck me, carried forward by its momentum, I went tumbling down the slope. My shoulder struck the stone and sent the gun flying free from my hands as my roll downhill started. The pale thing and I were so tangled up that it rolled right along with me. I felt its limbs limply strike at me as we rolled, and I could tell warm splatters of blood from where I'd shot it were falling on me. I reached out to grab something that would end our tumble, but the fucking creature wrapped its bony fingers around my arm so tight it felt like a vice. After what felt like an eternity having my body battered against the stones of the cave floor, we finally slid off the edge of the decline and off what seemed to be a drop of a few feet. I landed on my ribs, sending a sharp pain up my side, leading to a shout I couldn't hear. I lay there for a few moments with the glowing white thing's limbs tangled around me. The dim light emanating from its body was the only thing keeping total darkness at bay. It seemed my flashlight and shotgun had fallen somewhere else, and I had little hope of finding them. I tried to get to my feet, my palms pressing into the muck covering the ground as the thing slid free from me, limply making clear what I had already figured out. It was dead, or at least close to death. I stayed on my knees for a moment, turned the creature over on its back. First thing I noticed was that its body was exactly what Spoons had described the night he died. Something like a spindly human. There was a huge wound in its chest from where the buckshot had struck it point blank. The burn marks from the closeness of the shot stuck out on the stark white of its skin. Then, for the first time, I got a good look at that thing's face. It looked like a deformed man without a stitch of hair, not even eyebrows. Its lips were withered back to reveal its darkly stained teeth and gums. It had gaunt cheeks and high cheekbones, which along with a low brow and deep-set eyes made it look almost like a bear's skull. Something made me lean closer to see the eyes hidden in the shadowed sockets. I wanted them to be animal, alien, something like a goat's eye or maybe a cat's. But what I saw was something else entirely. Its eyes shifted and looked at me, making me jump back. It sucked in a labored breath as it opened its clenched jaws and let its tongue loll from its mouth. I leaned close again, sure that it was dying, and saw a look I hadn't seen since Vietnam. I saw the look of a man who knew all too well that he was about to die. The dim white glow had started to fade from its body as well, signifying that its time was nearly up. With one last surge of energy, its spindly arms shot up, and I felt its bony fingers dig into the back of my neck. It pulled me close, so my ear was right next to its wretched little mouth. Its light had nearly faded away to nothingness, and the dark of the cave closed in on me as I felt the oppressive nature of the silence begin to lift. This breath was as cold as the breeze coming off the water, like the first time I'd stepped through the door and I heard something. It made garbled noises that may or may not have been language, but the last sound it made was something I understood all too well. Its fingers loosened and its hand slid free and fell to the ground with an audible thud. The last of its light faded away and left me sitting on the floor of the cave, blind and confused. I took a deep breath and found that I was terribly aware of the sound of the air being sucked into my lungs and exhaling back out again. My ribs ached and I made a grunt as I got to my feet, stuck my hands out in front of me before stumbling forwards. Every step echoed as I groped blindly for some sense of direction. After a few moments, my hand came in contact with the slimy cave wall. I slid along with careful steps, always fearing a drop-off was going to sneak up on me and send me plummeting down another decline towards God knows what. I thought about the creature I just killed as I moved, unable to get its face out of my head. The all-too-human look in its eyes stuck with me terribly, and indeed it still burned into my mind. It was clear that somehow it had been making me deaf, or dampening the sound around it. I wasn't sure which, though either one seemed downright impossible. After a few moments of blind movement, my eyes started to adjust enough to give me dim outlines, and I realized I'd been moving deeper into the cave. I felt a tinge of panic wash over me, a desire to run back the way I'd come, shimmy up towards the light and get to safety. Everything was wrong down there, and I felt as if I was inching ever closer to the hill with every step. But I had to shovel those instincts down and press on. I had to find Tyler. I wasn't gonna give up on my boy.
My phone rang, causing me to jump, tearing my eyes away from my grandfather's story. I set the book down and took a deep breath, finding myself quite aware of the sound of my own breathing, and answered. Hello? I got to my feet and stretched, the story still weighing on my head and seemingly calling me back to finish it.
Alex, it's Dad.
My father's voice came over the line and snapped me into the conversation. Hey, Dad, what's up? I started pacing the room and stretching my legs. I hadn't realized how long I'd been sitting.
Alex, in that box that you found, was there a monogrammed journal by any chance?
I stopped pacing and flicked my eyes toward the books as my dad continued.
It was your grandfather's. He used to keep it with his books downstairs, but I can't find it.
I don't know why, but I felt the overwhelming urge to lie. I didn't see one. I can check again if you want. I felt a little ill. I hated lying to my father, and I had no idea why I did.
Okay.
He let out a deep sigh. It was either frustration or relief, I couldn't tell.
Listen, if you find it, just bring it back tomorrow. Your grandpa kept some personal information in there, and I want to make sure it gets taken care of properly.
My ears caught what I never expected to hear. He was lying too. Sure thing. I leaned down and picked up the book, running my finger over the leather cover. See you tomorrow, Dad.
See you tomorrow, son.
His voice sounded far away as he hung up. I thought for a few moments about the short but seemingly telling discussion between my father and me. He knew I had it, and I think he knew I was reading it. So why did we both lie about it? Why did I not tell him I had it? And why did he not tell me the truth about why he wanted it back? I fell back into my chair and thumbed back through the pages to get to where I'd left off. I needed to know the end.
Part 3. The cave seemed to get harder as I edged my way along the wall and towards my then unknown destination. I could feel the sweat dripping off my brow and stinging my useless, at the moment anyway, eyes. The slime that covered everything seemed to get thicker as I walked. I could hear the suctioning sound as my boots depressed into the viscous, mucus-like substance. After the thing swallowed all the sound around me, I thought that maybe even a sound that disgusting would be a welcome relief. But it wasn't. Nor was the sound of the thing using Spoon's voice, whispering in my ear. "Wake us, Teddy. We will let you hear the songs. Wake us," said the knot Spoons. It returned to me as I walked. Started to wonder if I was delirious or if the insanity of that place had turned my brain to scrambled eggs. I could see it gliding alongside me as I moved. It was darker than the pitch black that surrounded it. Somehow, it was a complete void, even when wreathed in shadow. "You can't be real," I told the non-Spoons. I shifted my feet towards it again, slowly, making a tiny bit more progress. "Spoons is dead. No one dies with us." Not Spoons hissed at me. I was reminded of the serpent in the story of Adam and Eve. It moved directly in front of me, blocking my forward progress. I not only stopped, but recoiled backwards to avoid touching whatever it was. Something primal told me that I didn't want to make contact. Its eyes shot open, a brilliant white glare pouring from them and forcing me to shield my eyes. Its mouth drooped open as well, and it too glowed with a bright light. A sound filled my ears like the static on a radio turned down very low, and something even below that. A frequency that made my stomach churn and my head hurt. The not Spoon's voice left my ears and suddenly entered my head directly. "Wake us, wake us, wake us." I fell to my knees, fruitlessly clutching at my ears. My whole body felt total discomfort, like my brain had told every muscle it was weak and useless. My own jaw drooped, and I could feel the drool leaking from the side of my mouth. I felt an urge to claw the skin from my face that I resisted as I made an attempt to scream for the thing to leave me alone. I wondered if that would be the moment where if I hadn't already gone insane, there would be no turning back. And then I lost all hope of leaving that cave alive. Then, there was total silence. I raised my head and opened my eyes, only to see the not Spoons still standing right in front of me. Its eyes still wide, its jaw still slack, but for some reason, it had gone completely silent. I used the wall to pull myself back to my feet, and that's when I saw the steady, white glow moving up quickly from behind not Spoons. Before I could react, the not Spoons turned to a dark mist as one of the sound swallowers exploded through him and slammed into me at full force. "Bothersome creatures." In my mind, I heard the not Spoon's voice hiss as the sound swallower and I went tumbling to the ground. Its spindly frame writhed on top of me in an attempt to gain leverage. It knotted thin fingers, finding my throat and digging in as it sat up and started attempting to strangle the life from me. I thrashed around in some attempt to wriggle free, but the creature had pinned me down with a weight that seemed unfitting for its frame. The edges of my vision were starting to turn black, and my hand frantically searched around me for something to help, when my fingertips landed on a loose stone. I heard the not Spoon's laugh in that wicked voice. I grabbed the rock tightly in my fist and brought it up as hard as I could into the thing's temple. I could see its eyes widen and its deep-set sockets and its mouth droop open, but it continued to squeeze. I did it again and again, and then, feeling drops of warm blood fall down onto my face as its grip finally loosened, and I was able to buck it to the side and watch it slide off of me. I rolled into the leverage position, overtaken by a kind of bloodlust that could only be brought on by the threat of death. I brought the stone down into its head over and over again. I felt its skin tear, its blood spill, and its bones shatter. I struck for as long as it took for the sound of my own screams to fill my ears as the sound swallower's light finally faded.
Teddy, you always had a penchant for the messy kills.
The knot spoon said. I could almost feel the darkness off its touch as its shadow hands gripped my shoulders.
You are not my friend.
I shook myself free and fell forward off the sound swallower and made a meek attempt to get to my feet on wobbly legs. The adrenaline was making me feel sick. I wonder if you're even real. I looked at it again, just a silhouette somehow darker than the shadows around it. Maybe I finally got insane. I motioned down the passage and opened those glowing eyes, once again filling my ears with a low discomfort and static.
Perhaps you have yet to earn true madness, Teddy.
It stepped to the side to allow me to pass.
Shall we see if we can find it?
I heard it laugh again. This time the cave walls seemed to shudder as it did. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it wasn't. The fucking walls were laughing at me. I wanted nothing more than to turn around and make my way back to the outside world, to feel fresh air fill my lungs, and to escape the consistent and oppressive heat that had taken over the further down I'd gone. I'd already lost my best friend to that place, though. I would not lose my son. I started walking, and the cave continued to laugh. Each step I took was lit by the eyes of the knot spoons hovering over my shoulder like some kind of guardian angel. I did my best to ignore the static in my ears or the whisper in my mind.
Wake us.
The tunnel I was following had become incredibly humid. I could feel my sweat sticking my shirt to my skin and making my palms slick as I slid along the wall. Every once in a while, a rush of warm air, like the breath of some great giant, would come sweeping through the tunnel and fill it with a foul stink. Something in between wet, rusted metal and rotten meat. More than once, it caused me to gag, and I could feel the cavern shake in response, like it was mocking me. Finally, the passage began to widen, and then open up entirely. I found myself standing at the mouth of a massive cavern roughly the size of a football stadium. There was a dim, throbbing light that permeated throughout the stone walls, giving me the ability to see what I just stumbled across, even if I didn't entirely understand it. The entire cave floor was covered in huge, pulsing fluid sacs, each one about the size of a mid-sized truck, and spaced out perfectly, as if they'd been engineered to be there. I walked closer, the whispers of the knot spoons getting louder in my head. I could see large shapes of inky darkness suspended inside each of the fluid sacs. They seemed to be breathing in unison, agreeing the source of the pulsing light as the darkness of their forms would spread out and expose a core of light deep within at the height of each inhale. In the distance, I could see something running back and forth between the sacs. It looked like little more than a shadow from the distance I was at. I prayed it might be Tyler and started approaching cautiously. I wanted so desperately to call out, but I was terrified that I would attract more of the sound swallowers.
Wake us up.
The knot spoons floated alongside me, screaming in my ear and filling it with that horrible static. I pressed on, trying to ignore it and pretend that I wasn't suddenly fully aware of who had wanted me to wake. I was letting my eyes adjust, and the form running around in front of me started to come into view. Then I heard his voice, dimming and returning with the pulse, like someone was playing with the volume knob on reality. It was Tyler.
Wake up. Wake up. Wake up. Wake up.
back and forth between the giant abscess-like domes and smashing his fists against them. They'd wiggle like jello, and the cave would respond with an overall shake of its own, but the creatures within didn't wake. The knot spoons blocked my view of Tyler just as I was about to run over to him. Its terrible hiss filled my ears for a moment before it motioned to the base of the closest abscess. I could see shapes piled together on the ground. As the dim light rose and fell, it became clear what I was seeing. Sound swallowers. Dozens of them. They were surrounding the bases, as some of the abscesses, with what looked like organic tubes shoved down their throats. My stomach turned over, and I had to hold back a retch. They were fast asleep and feeding. Knot Spoons put a finger to his lips, and I heard a gentle hush in my mind. This time I fully intended to listen too. As I looked around, I spotted more. Hundreds, in fact. I became far more aware of Tyler's stilted screams. I narrowed my eyes to look at the abscess he was pounding on, and luckily, it appeared to be unoccupied at the moment. I began making my way towards him, the Knot Spoons laughing in my ear the whole time. I called to him in the lowest volume I could, timing my voice with the rise of the light. "Tyler!" He didn't hear me, but instead walked away from his chosen ground protrusion and fell backwards against the wall. He was shaking his head back and forth and covering his ears. I wondered who he was seeing in the dark. What voice was whispering to him? "Tyler!" A little louder this time. My heart skipped a beat as the sound swallowers closest to me stirred. His head popped like he'd just been startled awake. Then he met my eyes. He looked like he'd been through war, and I didn't want to imagine what he'd endured to end up in that awful place. I just wanted to get him out. I motioned to him to come to me, hoping he could tiptoe back through the cavern and find our way to the exit. Fight off the nagging persistence of the shadows together. He started to pull himself up, but quickly fell back to the ground and started shaking his head and shouting something that I couldn't understand in the constantly fading sound.
Wake us, wake us, wake us.
The Knot Spoon's voice continued its onslaught of maddening whispers. I took a step forward, but the shadow moved in front of me quickly and snapped its mouth open. The loud burst of static that shot into my brain caused a pain I could feel behind my eyes as I lashed out blindly, shouting something into the deaf ears of the world around me as I fell backwards into something far too soft to be rocks. I'd fallen into the sound swallower's feeding crevice. Its skin felt like slugs beneath my fingertips, and suddenly the world went silent. They were awake. The spots in my vision cleared up, and I started scrambling to my feet. My hands gripped the rough stones at the edge of the dining area, and I worked to pull myself out. I could already feel long, spindly fingers gripping at my pants. They were slow to wake, and the electro-jerk gave me just enough of an edge to kick myself free and get to my feet. My heel caught the nearest one on the cheekbone, and I could see its face contort with a screech I couldn't hear. I started pointlessly screaming for Tyler out of reflex. He still had his head in his hands and sat rocking back and forth. I got to my feet just in time to see another group of sound swallowers rise from their slumber and begin crawling towards him.
Wake us up, Teddy. We can help him. We can help you. Wake us up.
The Knot Spoons repeated these phrases over and over again. One would start before the other even finished. It was like a whole chorus of horrors pretending to be my friend. They felt as if they were born into my skull, and I saw the sound swallowers swarm my son. I could see him screaming as glowing fingers clawed into his skin and pulled him back to a cold reality. I turned to see the ones behind me closing in, the one in the lead ripping the tube from its mouth, and seemed to grin after it did it. Blood poured from its cheek where I'd kicked it. The whole scene seemed to happen in slow motion. I could see the Knot Spoons floating behind them as they leapt towards me. He was pointing towards one of the bulbs. I managed to weave out of the way of the lead sound swallower and make a dash towards the fluid sac. It was our only chance. If it was lying, then we would die. But if it didn't wake it up, we would die anyway. I glanced back at Tyler. The sound swallowers had piled on him, and I could see fists raining down on him. I was almost glad I couldn't hear anything. I couldn't bear the sound of his screams. I grabbed a rock as I moved past another glowing monster and toward my goal. I felt its fingers dig into my shoulder until I drove the rock into its forearm with what I imagined would have been an audible snap following. I jumped across the feeding pit and slammed the sharpest edge of the rock into the side of the fluid sac. Its outer skin rippled, and I felt a squirt of whatever was inside shoot out all over my hand.
Yes.
I heard the knot spoons hiss in my ear. I could see him out of the corner of my eye, smiling through static. Before I could drag the rock down over my skin and cut the thing from its bubble, more glowing fingers grabbed me and pulled me downwards. I fought against him as hard as I could, but in the midst of a strike, the rock slipped from my hand. I managed to catch the lead one in the jaw with an elbow that gave me just enough room to jump back toward the fluid sac and dig my fingers into the small opening I'd created. I felt thin arms wrap around me and pull backwards again. A fist crashed into my head, skull sunk into my shoulder, but nothing stopped me from tearing it open. I felt a thick, soupy fluid that smelled like rot and sugar pour out over me, sending all of us sprawling backwards into the feeding pit. It was like a writhing mass of limbs violently thrashing as that horrid liquid poured down on us. I scrambled to get back to solid ground, to get away from whatever I'd just unleashed.
Oh, Teddy, you've done well.
The knot spoon's voice slowly dimmed inside my head as I crawled onto a higher rock and turned to look at the fluid sac I just opened. Most of the liquid had drained out of it, and there was simply a darkened mass sitting there with a pulsing white light peeking out from inside of it. The sound swallowers beneath it stared up in awe as it began to unfold. I felt a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach as it hit me what I was seeing, what I'd just done. I was looking at pure evil, and it smiled at me. It was like thousands of snakes made not of flesh, but of pure darkness, coiled around each other to make a man. I could see the frame, 2 legs, 2 arms, a torso, and a head. The whole thing standing at least 10 feet tall. Tendrils opened off its back like wings, but they writhed like worms in the beak of a bird. Much like the knot spoons, its face was little more than openings in its head, which a hideous white light poured out from. The same light you could see between the cracks in its body, where the pieces slid around each other but didn't quite close. The sound swallowers attempted to turn away from it, but it let out a noise that made me feel sick to my stomach. Like the static on a dying radio, white noise that was somehow filled with the sound of decay. The sound swallowers, unable to dampen the noise for some reason, all fell to the ground. I looked over at the ones who had surrounded Tyler, and they were doing the same. My boy sitting in the corner of them with his hands over his ears. All of their glows dimmed as they started attempting to crawl to some safety that I was sure didn't exist. I could see the veins in their bodies bulge and begin to pop, blood oozing from new wounds and striping their pale white bodies with red. That was when I heard them scream. Except this time, it was framed in complete agony and presented like a harmonic chorus of the creature's suffering. The darkness stood tall, its body finally forming to a point it was satisfied, when it began to stride across the cavern. Each sound swallower it passed would fall into convulsions and suffer a few seconds of that death rattle before falling silent and still. I watched it move to the field of bodies it was creating with the pride of an attendant gardener surveying his crop. I was in shock and filled with terror that froze my bones as it turned its attention towards me, reminding me I was not just some passive observer. I was responsible for unleashing this nightmare. The thoughts that filled my head as I met its infinite white gaze are painful to recall. I knew, though, that it might have been preferable to just let the sound swallowers kill Tyler and me. I could hear something like mocking laughter behind the dead static. Suddenly, the ache in my stomach caused me to double over in complete pain and begin to cough and retch. I tasted iron and salt, and I watched my own blood splatter to the ground with each hard heave.
Teddy, you are in no shape to do what we need.
I heard the knot spoons whisper to me as I fell completely to the ground, my body too weak to move.
Perhaps soon.
I looked across the cavern floor and saw Tyler laying amid a pile of dimming corpses, his body convulsed and spasmed against the stone as the darkness turned from me and approached him. There was a feeling of hunger that radiated out from it, a vile hunger that twisted the sickness I already felt in my stomach.
Stay away from him.
I could hear my own screams again, for all the good it did. It was like yelling at the wind or the sunlight. This was not a thing you could command.
Incentive.
The knot spoons laughed a raspy laugh in my ear. I watched the darkness reach down and lift my boy off the ground. It held him with both arms like it was cradling a baby. It turned its mockery of a face toward me to make sure I was watching, and then looked down at Tyler. I tried to get to my feet. Oh God, how I tried. It was like someone had tied me down and put weights on my back. All I could do was lay there, screaming and spitting blood as the thing pressed a finger to Tyler's lips. It opened its eyes and mouth, making sure the scene was well lit for me, as bits of the darkness, like worms, crawled from its hand and into Tyler's nose, mouth, and eyes. His body was shaking harder, and I saw him start gasping for air. His hands flailed around, trying to find purchase on something, and ended up clutching at his chest. I could hear the knot spoon's laughter as I screamed. I screamed so hard the world started to fade at the edges of my vision. The last thing I saw was the darkness drop my boy to the ground, his body finally lying still. Then the world went black. I woke to a world that was a complete juxtaposition of what I had just witnessed. Before my eyes even opened, I could hear the chirping of birds and feel the wet grass beneath me. The air had the sweet scent of the morning forest as I drew in a deep breath. My mouth still tasted like blood, and I could feel the rawness of my throat from screaming. I let my eyes slowly adjust to the bright light of the morning sun, squinting to my surroundings as I pulled myself into a sitting position. The aches on my body proved the truth of what I had been through, each bruise like a dull thud through my muscles as I stretched my back and shoulders. My eyes finally adjusted to the rising sun enough for me to survey where I was, and I saw Tyler and my tents only a few feet from where I was. Tyler rushed into my mind, clearing away the sleep. "Tyler!" I ignored the pain in my throat and shouted with all the air in my lungs. I looked around where I was and didn't see him near me. "Tyler!" I shouted again, springing to my feet and ignoring the creaking of my bones and tenderness in my body. I kept screaming his name as I rushed towards the campsite, hoping against all odds I'd find him curled up in his tent. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, though, when I first went to look for him, and he was still nowhere to be seen. Heart race and panic set in as I finally searched the area. Each minute that passed felt like an eternity of not knowing. The darkness. Did it take him? Was he dead? Did he become like Spoons, some puppet of being I'd unleashed onto the world? The questions came to a head in my mind and broke on the beach of my sanity, threatening to erode it away entirely. Just when I thought the pit in my stomach would swallow me whole, I found him. He was sitting up against a tree with his legs folded and his arms resting on his lap. His skin was ghostly pale, and he was covered in cuts and bruises. His neck was craned upwards towards the mountain. His mouth was drooping like all the muscles in his face refused to work, and his eyes were open and wide as dinner plates. "Tyler!" I knelt down in front of him, put a hand on his shoulder. He didn't look in my direction, just continued staring off towards the mountain.
"Tyler, wake up."
He was already awake, though. I knew he was awake. My boy was catatonic. His mind had left his body. The last 6 months have been hospitals and doctors telling me they can't understand it. How could they, though? They weren't there. I know what caused it, but no one would ever believe a word of it. My wife sure didn't when I finally had to tell her the truth. I'd be lucky if she doesn't leave me. She, like them, still thinks he suffered some sort of psychotic break or head injury. Of course, they all think he got his injuries from falling down a steep hill while hiking the mountain trail. What the fuck else was I gonna tell him? It wasn't until recently that I finally had to tell her the truth. I didn't have a choice. We'd taken Tyler home from the mental clinic to be in more familiar surroundings. It's not like they were doing a damn thing for him anyway. He just sat there, staring out his window and drooling. God, my poor boy. He was always so full of life, and seeing him like that crushed me. I dealt with it, though. I fed him, I bathed him, and I helped him go to the goddamn bathroom. It was my fault, my responsibility. I never should have let him come. I did everything I could, and I prayed he'd come out of it. It's all over now, though. 2 weeks ago, Tyler hung himself. I found him hanging from the ceiling fan in his room. When I left for the store, he'd been quiet, just like always. Sometime while I was buying smokes and Advil, my boy woke up from his catatonic state and tied his bed sheets into a noose, like he was in fucking prison. After we buried him, I told Harriet the truth. I told her everything. She looked at me like I was crazy and cursed me for letting him come with me that day. The next day, she left, took Cal with her. That ice-cold look on her face still hurts me. These next pages were clearly written later. They are more scribbled and less coherent. Tyler appeared at the foot of my bed last night. He looked like a shadow till he opened his eyes and mouth. He'd become not Tyler. I hoped and prayed I'd wake up screaming that it was all some kind of nightmare. Then he spoke.
"Dad, you want to come with us? They will play the music for you. The beautiful music. They helped me hear it so much better."
He strolled to the side of me and knelt down close.
"Wake us up, wake us up, wake us up, wake us up."
He won't go away. There was a murder in town today. The first one in 25 years. A man beat his wife to death with a socket wrench when she told him to come in for dinner. Tyler is still over my shoulder. He's laughing. It's the thing I let loose. It wants me to free the rest of them. Harriet came back. She can't see him. She talked earnestly about how much she loves me and about how Cal needs me. I tried to listen, but not Tyler wouldn't stop talking in my ear. He kept telling me to bring the whole family home to him. He'd let them all hear the music. I started crying. I don't know if it was because of Harriet's love or not Tyler's hatred. The darkness is hanging over this town like a smog or a toxin. We should leave. 3 more murders and 2 suicides in the last 6 months. For a town as small as ours, that's unheard of. Police and local government are in a panic. It's that damn thing. Every time I hear about it happening again, the not Tyler laughs. I drove towards the woods yesterday. I didn't even realize I was doing it till I was more than halfway there. We need to leave. I'm trying my best to convince Harriet. She's starting to realize, I think. I woke up at the base of the mountain this morning. I had apparently left without a word in the middle of the night, and I hiked all the way back to that terrible fucking place. I could see that damned cave above me. It looked like it was breathing. Its mouth kept expanding and contracting like it was preparing itself to devour any who came near it. I ran back to my car and drove at top speed all the way back home. Another murder was being talked about on the news when I opened the door. I think I must have looked insane as I started hastily packing my things. Harriet asked where I'd been, what was going on. I think she understood how serious I was when she saw the panic in my eyes. We're staying in a hotel tonight, and then getting as far from that place as possible. Then not Tyler is screaming, but I hope he fades the further we get. Dear God, I'm sorry for what I've done.
That was the end of my grandfather's notebook. I set it down on my coffee table and ran my hands over my face, trying hard to take in everything I'd just read. There were 2 possible options. The grandfather I'd grown up with was actually completely insane, probably some sort of psychotic break suffered after the death of his son. The other option is that the story was true, or at least mostly true. Neither one of these options made me feel good. There was a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach that refused to go away. I got up, got some water, and paced for a while. My father knew something about this. It was the only reason I could think of that he would be looking for the book. He didn't want me to have it for some reason. He didn't want me to know. Why? I crawled into bed that night with that question planted firmly in the forefront of my mind. It kept me awake for quite some time, too. I remember seeing the digital readout on my clock, reading 3 o'clock, when my eyelids finally started to feel heavy. I decided I would see my father in the morning and confront him about all of it, and started to drift away to sleep.
Do you hear the music?
The question filled my ears at the moment things had gotten most silent. That second right before you fall into the abyss of sleep. I shot up out of bed and flickered on my light. It's that damn story. It got under my skin. I told myself under my breath. I could swear, though, that the voice was one I recognized. As I shut off the light and tried to remind myself that it was probably just my imagination playing tricks on me, I realized whose voice it was. It was my grandfather's. Even worse than that realization was that I started to pick up on the faintest sound of static. The music of the darkness. I didn't sleep that night.
What do you know about this?
I threw the notebook down on the table and it slid over to where my father was sitting. He looked down at it for a second before realizing what it was, and a frown fell over his face. You did have it. He ran a palm over his mouth and looked up at me with concerned eyes. Did you read it?
Yeah.
Grandpa wrote down quite a story about your brother and him. I pulled out a chair and took a seat in front of him with my arms folded.
You already know that, don't you?
You shouldn't have read it. My dad ran his hands over the cover of the journal and shook his head. I wasn't supposed to let you.
What?
I leaned forward and raised a quizzical eyebrow.
Why not?
Your grandfather, he thought that it might affect you. He thought it might affect anyone that read it, to be honest. He fiddled with the cover. I always wanted to read it growing up. He never let me.
Wait, you haven't read it?
No, he'd never let me. My dad pushed the book away in frustration. The old man always said he was protecting me, that no one should know what was in there. I ran my fingers through my hair and exhaled deeply. I could feel the frustration building in my chest. My father got up and walked over to an open bottle of scotch, seemingly not caring that the clock hadn't even struck noon yet. He looked over at me and opened his mouth as if he was about to say something, but stopped himself and poured a drink instead.
What?
I asked him, begging him to start his thought. He said he saw my brother when I was younger. He took a sip from his glass as he walked back over to his seat. Eventually, he claimed he didn't want to talk about it anymore. That ignoring it was the only thing that made it go away.
Jesus.
Suddenly, I felt like I should have a drink too. How long had my grandfather been subjected to the presence of his dead son? Your grandfather thought he was incapable of dealing with the grief. He blamed himself. One time he told me the truth was written in that fucking book. He gestured towards the journal. Then he told me I could never read it. I walked over and picked up the book again. It felt heavy in my hands, like a burden. Son, I don't know what to believe about your grandfather. Maybe he carried guilt with him. Maybe he was crazy. Maybe he actually saw my brother's ghost. Or maybe just something pretending to be Tyler's ghost. Something old and evil. Something dangerous. All I know is that he was certain reading that book would expose me to whatever he felt he was enduring. Maybe even pass it on. I looked up and saw my dad staring off into space as he swallowed the last of the drink. He got up to pour himself one, but I stopped him and went to grab the bottle.
Pass it on?
I asked as I sat down across from him and poured him another drink. Yeah. We sat silently for another 10 or so minutes, each of us absorbed in thought. I could tell my father was torn between asking exactly what I read and honoring the wishes of his father. I was thinking about the concept of passing it on and the sound of static I'd heard when I tried to sleep the night before. The sound of static and the voice of someone I loved who'd passed away. Someone who'd been in that thing's presence, if you believe his story. Someone who may have carried that darkness with him his whole life. We'd burned the journal after that conversation. My dad kept his curiosity in check, and I never forced him to hear the story. I don't know how he could believe it anyway. I believe it, though, with every inch of my heart. I believed every story my grandfather told, the truth and the lies. This one I have proof for, though. At least proof enough for me. If you choose to believe it, That's up to you. The proof is there every time my grandfather speaks to me from behind a hiss of static, or when he appears at the foot of my bed when I try to sleep. His eyes large and white, his mouth slack and glowing with some power from within. I've seen him every day since we burned that journal, always saying the same things.
Come join me. I can make you hear the music. Wake us up, wake us up, wake us up, wake us up. Thank you for listening and delving with me into the dark together.
Please remember to leave a thumbs up and subscribe if you feel so inclined. The more engagement this video gets, the more YouTube will push my content to others.
Thus, the following will grow.
All stories read in this channel will be available on Spotify, iTunes, and just about everywhere else. Links in the description.
Thank you for listening and feeding the cause. We'll be seeing you